Welcome, everyone, to the Sanibel Online Writers Conference. I'm Tom DeMarchi, and this is my co-director, Jason Ellick. Hey, Jason.
How's it going, Tom? Good morning, everybody.
We're so excited that you're tuning in. We have a terrific lineup this year. We have 8 hours of nonstop writing fun for you. So without going into it any further, I'm going to hand it off to Jason and let him introduce our first panel.
Thanks, Tom. Our first panel is Beth Fennelly, Major Jackson, and Denise Duhamel. I'm going to introduce them very quickly. I want to say I'm super excited to be here. I'm glad you guys are all tuning in. This is going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to introduce them very quickly so they can do their thing. Beth Fennelly recently finished a term as Mississippi's Poet Laureate, which I've heard is kind of a big deal. Her most recent book is Heating and Cooling 52 Micro Memoirs. Major Jackson's published 5 books of poetry, including last year's The Absurd Man. And Denise Duhamel published her 14th book of poetry this year, and it's titled Second Story. All 3 of these outstanding poets have earned numerous awards, fellowships. Their poetry has been published in countless anthologies. I teach them in my classes. We all do. All 3 are also fantastic teachers. And I learn from them every time I listen to them talk about their craft. So you might want to make sure you've got your notebooks, your pencils handy, and we'll listen in while Beth Ann, Major, and Denise talk about unpacking a poem. So take it away, guys.
Great. Well, thank you. I understand I'm first. And I want to say I'm so happy to be on this panel with Major and Denise, who are 2 poets that I've loved for many years and have admired and have all their books. Although, Jesus Lord, Denise, 15 books? Is that possible? I'm not possible. And I'm really happy to be part of the Sanibel Island virtual day today. Sanibel Island is like my happy place, to the point where, and Tom DeMarchi knows this, on my phone with the weather app, I always have Sanibel Island, because when I check what the weather is here, it just makes me happy to think that it's 85 and sunny in Sanibel, that place exists. It's waiting for us. And I hope we all meet there next November and have all this great passion for writing and fun and music take place in person. So thank you very much. The idea of unpacking a poem and kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of what we love is something I could do all day. So that's another reason why I was thrilled to be on this panel. And I wanted to do something today where, to unpack the poem, I model how I read it the first time I read the poem and how I've come to read it now. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because we understand that some artworks takes place almost instantaneously and some takes place in time. For example, when you see a painting, it's all in front of you and your eye has its own pattern and it goes through, but it's all something that you can see at one time, as opposed to, say, an artwork like architecture, where you have to walk in one room before you have to walk in another. And the room that you are in influences your feelings as you enter the next room, that influences your feelings as you enter the next room. Or a piece of music where something is lingering in your head. We tend to think of novels as taking place in time and forget, because poems tend to be shorter, that they also take place in time. And your ordering of processing through the poem and the unfolding of the syntax is actually engaging your mind in a certain way that you might forget about later when you know the poem really well, what it was like to read it the very first time. So I've picked a poem that I love and have learned from. And it's by Jericho Brown, and it's a poem called The Tradition, and it's from his book called The Tradition. And I see that Karen has nicely pulled up my PowerPoint, so hopefully I will be able to take us through it. I am going to attempt to share this PowerPoint with y'all. File. Let's see. Karen, how do I get it to move forward now? Stop screen. Okay, share. I'm trying it the old-fashioned way here. Share screen, window. I'm going to do it myself. Share. All right, there it is, The Tradition. Denise, you can see this, right? Can everybody see this? Can anyone talk to me? Okay, I'm just assuming you can.
I'm sorry, we can. I pressed the wrong button. We can see it.
Thanks. I just needed to know that I'm not like off in the ether somewhere here. Okay, So imagine you're reading this poem for the very first time and you know nothing about this poem, and I hope that's the case with some of you. The first thing you see is the title, The Tradition. Here's the first line: Aster, nasturtium, delphinium, we thought. Okay, so the very first time you're reading it, you're processing your thoughts very quickly, but you might be thinking something like, okay, flowers, 3 formal Latinate flower names. These are this is the type of thing you expect in a poem, to have flowers. Poetry is floral and decorative. You might be noticing the assonance in aster, nasturtium, or the chum sound in nasturtium and delphinium. Aster, nasturtium, delphinium. We thought fingers in dirt meant it was our dirt. Learning names and heat in elements classical philosophers said could change us. Stargazer, foxglove. Okay, so the very first time working through this poem, you might now be thinking fingers in dirt meant it was our dirt, knowing that Jericho Brown is African-American, grew up in Louisiana. His dad cut lawns for a living. He would pick Jericho up after school in high school, and Jericho Brown would cut lawns with him and do landscaping. And so perhaps we're beginning to understand fingers in dirt meant it was our dirt, that the men who create these gardens are not the ones who get to enjoy these gardens. And the garden, and learning these names falsely allows these men to think that they will have agency or possession. Stargazer, foxglove, again, beautiful flower names. Now we're moving to some common names. Summer seemed to bloom against the will of the sun, which news reports claimed flamed hotter on the planet than when our dead fathers wiped sweat from their necks. Cosmos, baby's breath. Okay, so now in my head, maybe the first time I'm flickering back to the title, The Tradition, and seeing first there's the tradition of racial inequality in our country. And now we have this other tradition, this inheritance of environmental degradation. The sun is getting hotter. So I'm kind of following along with some of those threads. Men like me and my brothers filmed what we planted for proof we existed before. Okay. Men like me and my brothers, this is our first introduction of first person. We see that the syntax and diction, me and my brothers instead of my brothers and I, is a little casual here. There seems to be maybe a tonal shift. And now we're understanding that these men who are gardening were filming what they were planting for proof we existed. Okay, that's kind of interesting to me. Before, too late. Sped the video to see blossoms brought in seconds, colors you expect to see in poems. All right, so that's a little bit of a weird jump for me to go from men like me and my brothers filmed what we planted for proof we existed before, too late, comma. I feel the first time I read it, I register a little hiccup maybe in syntactical sibilance, but I am understanding this meaning that the men who are doing the landscaping would film a flower blossoming, and have it on that kind of fast forward motion. I understand that. Colors you expect to see in poems. I go back to the first line, the flowers I expect to see in poems, the colors I expect to see in poems. So is this kind of an ars poetica? I'm wondering. I see that I'm getting to the end of the poem, second to last line, where the world ends, everything cut down. And so now I see that they have taken videos of the flowers and they continue to when the flowers are cut down. And that's the end of the video, the life cycle of the flower. And I think, wow, that's really depressing. And then here's the last line: John Crawford, Eric Garner, Mike Brown. And what happened the very first time I read that poem is I had an audible gasp, because the whole poem transformed itself. Because what happens in the very last line is super shocking. First of all, the poem announces itself as a sonnet. For the first time, there had been no clue that this was a sonnet. Maybe you glanced at it, and if you've read a ton of poetry, you notice it's kind of sonnety length, but there's no meter, there's no rhyme scheme until we have that very, very strong concluding couplet with the 3 strong caesura. And now the poem doubles in your head. You've read it once through, understanding it one way. Now the poem doubles in your head with this crazy overlay where you understand that the whole poem is about racial terror. in addition to this gardening metaphor. So let's go back and read it one more time and understand how the poem has changed due to the nature of the last line, what's happening in the poem now. All right, so the tradition, aster, nasturtium, delphinium. Okay, we now know it's a sonnet. We could see, okay, there are 2 quatrains, and sure, the quatrains, they both begin with flowers in italics, and we do end up seeming to have a volta. But now these 3 names of the flowers have completely transformed for me because they match up with the 3 names of the murdered men at the end of the poem. And I understand now for the first time in a way that gives me chill bumps down my arm. And if I wasn't sharing screen, I would have to hold up my raggedy little forearm to the camera to show you I literally have chill bumps right now, understanding that these are flowers being placed on their men's graves. These 3 flowers for those 3 men, this has become a funerary display. Aster, nasturtium, delphinium. We thought fingers in dirt meant it was our dirt. Learning names and heat and elements classical philosophers said could change us. And in fact, they will have their fingers in the dirt, these men who are always going to be in jeopardy of being murdered in contemporary America, and they will be changed by the dirt in elements classical philosophers said could change us. Stargazer, foxglove, now I recognize these names as not just being names of flowers, not just being common names, but maybe trying to extend us with the idea of gazing at the stars, connecting us to the cosmos, thinking about animals and hands. Summer seemed to bloom against the will. Now I register against the will as bringing some threat into the poem I didn't understand before. Summer seemed to bloom against the will of the sun, which news reports claimed flamed hotter on the planet than when our dead fathers wiped sweat from their necks. And now I see the dead fathers as not just being like a historical reference, but a potential threat. There's death all around these young men gardening, and their fathers might be dead as well. Cosmos, again, tying us to the universe. And then baby's breath, because these are men who can go from baby birth to adulthood in the flash of a sped up camera and have that breath choked out of them. Men like me and my brothers, here we understand we have the volta taking place in the sonnet where we make this change to first person. Filmed what we planted for proof we existed before too late. That's actually still a difficult moment for me in the poem, and I'll be done in a sec. Maybe Major or Denise would have some insight for me on that. I'm not sure if it's a hiccup in the poem or my own understanding, but I still find that a little hard. So here we have a sentence that speeds up through 5 lines of enjambment, like the video speeding up of the men being killed, these terrible videos that we keep seeing again and again. And we understand that they are the flowers whose life cycle has been sped up too fast. And we have this filmic overlay, really. Before too late, sped the video to see blossoms brought in seconds, colors you expect in poems. And now I'm seeing also the terrible blossoming of the flower killed too soon, but also the blossoming of bullet holes and blood on these young men. Colors you expect in poems where the world ends, everything cut down. John Crawford, Eric Gardner, Mike Brown. These 3 men bloom into men cut down in their prime. And those strong caesura, not commas, but periods. And the names, these men's names echoing the names of the flowers in the opening. I find it very moving. And before I pass along, I just want to mention, I learned something interesting about this poem because there's a podcast called American Masters, Creative Spark. And the idea of this podcast is to focus in on just one work of art. So not to look at someone's oeuvre, which is a word I hate, but just one little piece of it. Like, how did this one thing get connected, right? So they actually interviewed Jericho Brown, 40-minute podcast segment about this poem. And what's really fascinating is he read an early version. And guess what, friends? It's not great. It is not great. And I mention that so we can take hope from that, because even Jericho Brown was not Jericho Brown when he wrote the first draft. So if you look at this sonnet and you're like, oh my God, my first reading, it was amazing. My 100th reading, it's amazing. How could I ever be as good as Jericho Brown? Jericho Brown was not as good as Jericho Brown. So listen to the podcast if you end up getting curious. For example, the original version was 27 lines long, almost twice as long as this 14-line sonnet. And the title was 2014, which is a terrible title because it makes it like it only happened once in history. And to call it the tradition ties us back into all the traditions, including the sonnet tradition, which is also Jericho Brown saying, I get to write this sonnet about racial injustice as well as flowers, like all you Victorian writers who were writing your sonnets about flowers. So he's expanding this notion of the tradition, our tradition of racial violence, our tradition of people gardening where they don't get to enjoy the flowers, our tradition of writing in the sonnet and claiming the power to write in the sonnet. So all these things are happening with his amazing title that became the title of his Pulitzer Prize winning book. But the original title stunk. 2014, 27 lines long. And when you hear the podcast, they play this kind of cheesy music as he's reading the early version, as if we're supposed to be amazed, and like be like moved, but you're really going to hear it's not great. So listen to the podcast and remind yourself the next time you write a stinky draft, it could be great later. And Sanibel Island Writing Conference could be having a panel where someone talks about how good it is. Thank you very much.
Denise, do you want to go next? Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
Hi, this is why I didn't do a PowerPoint. I was like, Beth Ann, that was fabulous. And, I just wanted to add, if we have time, how when I first read this, it was like, oh, this is definitely a Shakespearean sonnet, right? Because it has down and brown, those last two couplets. And then the second time I read it, it was like, oh my God, there's almost like two voltas. It's a Shakespearean and a Petrarchian. There's like the 8 and 6, and then there's also the 12 and 2. Anyway, that was fabulous. Thank you so much.
Sure, really thank you.
I'll add to that. Thank you, Beth Ann, for that reading of Jericho's poem. Extraordinary. I'll add to, it's important to say about that tradition is that it often starts in a space of kind of the speaker is often in this kind of perplexed space. When you enter into the sonnet, they are kind of triggered into speech. And sometimes it starts small, like he does here, and then opens up into these larger questions. And you definitely identified the purpose of that volta. But you just armed me with another sonnet to teach. And in addition to the podcast, I'm going to turn to this particular video and your beautiful discussion of it. Thank you.
Yeah, it was fabulous. Thank you. Thanks. Do you want me to go next, Major, or do you want to go next?
Mind?
No, I don't mind going next. And I'm so glad that Beth Ann talked about time, because that's one of the things that I really want to focus on in this poem called The Race by Sharon Ohls. And I don't have the technical dexterity of Beth Ann, so I didn't even try to do any sort of PowerPoint, but it's in the chat and you can click on it and you can follow along as I read. So I'm going to kind of do the opposite of what Beth Ann did, in that I'm going to read the whole poem first and then break it down. So you will find this poem. Hopefully you will find it and see it and be following along, or you can just listen. It's called The Race by Sharon Ohls. When I got to the airport, I rushed up to the desk, bought a ticket. 10 minutes later, they told me the flight was canceled. The doctors had said my father would not live through the night, and the flight was canceled. A young man with a dark brown mustache told me another airline had a nonstop leaving in 7 minutes. See that elevator over there? Well, go down to the first floor, make a right. You'll see a yellow bus. Get off at the second Pan Am terminal. I ran. I, who have no sense of direction, raced exactly where he told me. A fish slipping upstream deftly against the flow of the river. I jumped off that bus with those bags I had thrown everything into in 5 minutes and ran. The bags wagged me from side to side as if to prove I was under the claims of the material. I ran up to a man with a flower on his breast. I, who always go to the end of a line, I said, help me. He looked at my ticket, said, make a left and then a right, go up the moving stairs, and then run. I lumbered up the moving stairs. At the top, I saw the corridor. And then I took a deep breath. I said goodbye to my body, goodbye to comfort. I used my legs and heart as if I would gladly use them up for this, to touch him again in this life. I ran, and the bags banged against me, wheeled and coursed in skewed orbits. I have seen pictures of women running, their belongings tied in scarves, grasped in their fists. I blessed my long legs he gave me. My strong heart I abandoned to its own purpose. I ran to gate 17, and they were just lifting the thick white lozenge of the door to fit into the socket of the plane. Like the one who is not too rich, I turned sideways and slipped through the needle's eye. And then I walked down the aisle toward my father. The jet was full and people's hair was shining. They were smiling. The interior of the plane was filled with a mist of gold endorphin light. I wept as people weep when they enter heaven in massive relief. We lifted up gently from one tip of the continent and did not stop until we sat down lightly on the other edge. I walked into his room and watched his chest rise slowly and sink again. All night, I watched him breathe. So this poem to me, okay, so I read this poem. It was first originally published in 1992 in Sharon Ohls' book, The Father. However, I remember reading it in 1985, and I knew, you go back in your past. I knew where I was in 1985. I knew I was in New York. I knew I was in Key Foods, where they sell the New Yorker. And it was a really long line, and I picked up the New Yorker, and I read this poem, and I really had that bodily sensation that Dickinson so famously described, right? I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off. I know that is poetry. And I just thought this poem is like really important for my life. And not only a poem, it's going to teach me about life. It's going to teach me something really important. And I put back 2 bottles of cream soda, my favorite at the time, so that I could get the New Yorker, so I could have this poem. And I still have that copy of the New Yorker. And it prepared me, I think, for emergencies that were to come in life that I hadn't really yet experienced. And all of us will experience, unfortunately, at some point or another. So I wanted to talk about time and syntax and how weirdly compressed and back and forth time goes in this poem. So the poem, for those of you who are following along, it's full of run-on sentences. So if this were in a grammar class, it'd be like, no, Sharon, X, Y, this is 6 sentences. Why is it 1? But of course, it's Sharon Ohls, so she knows what she's doing. So it starts off with a run-on sentence, which is, if this were grammatically correct, it would read, when I got to the airport, I rushed up to the desk, bought a ticket, period. 10 minutes later, they told me the flight was canceled, period. The doctors had said my father would not live through the night and the flight was canceled, period. But by having all these clauses together and presented as one sentence, we get that jumbled feeling, right, of someone desperate to make sense of what she is hearing and what she's feeling. So the first worker that she encounters at the airport helps her kind of regulate her grammar. And it's as though the speaker knows she must focus, must rise to this very difficult occasion with everything she has. She notices his dark brown mustache, as though his whole mouth is just disembodied, and that's the only part of him she needs at this moment. And for anyone who's ever flown, I think this was maybe what was making my heart race so much in this poem. Mm-hmm. The idea that you have to get to a plane in 7 minutes is terrifying. The idea that she has to get on a bus, get off at the right terminal, and on and on. I mean, it was just like, oh my God, how she's not going to do it. It's almost like a chase scene or something that you expect in a movie. So see that again, it regulates when she's talking to the guy. And then he says, see that elevator over there? Again, sentence 1. Well, go down to the first floor, make a right. Sentence 2. You'll see a yellow bus. Sentence 3. Get off at the second Pan Am terminal. Sentence 4. I ran. Sentence 5, I have no sense of direction, raced exactly where he told me. A fish slipping upstream deftly against the flow of the river. So here we basically have 6 sentences in once, where she's just like, okay, boom, boom, boom. I'm gonna, like a montage almost, again, to use the film metaphor. So I think most readers have a sense of dread when we hear that she only has 7 minutes to do this, to get on a bus, the right bus, which is terrifying enough, get off at the right terminal, another terrifying thing. And notice that terminal and nonstop, they're definitely the languages of airports, right? But the idea that it's terminal, it takes on this whole other connotation, right? Because her father has a terminal condition, health condition. Nonstop is, again, just the way to describe the plane, but this poem is in constant motion, isn't nonstop. And I love this sense of admission. The speaker has no sense of direction, and yet again, she must know she has to summon all her strength to get through the day and not be helpless. And then, okay, without sentimentality, she just puts in the metaphor of the fish going against the flow of the river, but it also shows she's in a race against time, right? A race against time and going against everything she knows. So these lines, that she's doing this and that and doing what she has to do, almost reminded me of that concept of, it's called, I hate this word, but it is called hysterical strength. And it's this idea of the mother who lifts, the car or her child, or there was a mother who, went toe to toe with a polar bear, like at a hockey game or something, you just like get the strength. And although hers is a lot of mental strength, but it's that same thing. So she's going definitely out of her, what we would call now her comfort zone. And then another run-on sentence. I jumped off that bus with those bags I had thrown everything into in 5 minutes and ran. The bags wagged me from side to side as if to prove I was under the claims of the material. I ran up to a man with a flower on his breast. I, who always go to the end of the line, I said, help me. So once more, the speaker's cutting the line. She's asking for help. This time, the man has a flower on his breast, which is that one detail in keeping in line with the mustache. So she's just maybe taking snapshots, right, to get her from one place to another. And again, this nonstop terminal, the luggage we know is made of something, right? Luggage is physical. But when she says under the claims of the material, first you think like, come on, Sharon, what more detail? But no, the material world, right? She is under the claims of the material world. She's in an earthly body as opposed to the spiritual world, which we'll get to later in the poem. Another glorious run-on sentence. I lumbered up the moving stairs. At the top, I saw the corridor, and then I took a deep breath. I said goodbye to my body, goodbye to comfort. I used my legs and heart as if I would gladly use them up for this, to touch him again in this life. The desperation, right, like seems to be heightening as the speaker lumbers up the escalator. Again, you feel like the heaviness of her bags, the weight of the world, but also metaphorically the weight, she has in her heart. The bags banged against me, wheels and coursed in skewed orbits. I have seen pictures of women running, their belongings tied in scarves grasped in their fists. I blessed my long legs he gave me, my strong heart I abandoned to its own purpose. I ran to the gate, and they were just lifting up the thick white lozenge of the door to fit it into the socket of the plane. Again, she links herself, her actual body, to her father, right? He gave her the genetic material. And then she links herself to historical women in peril, which Sharon Ohls does a lot in her poems. Like it's like you think they're all about her, and they are about a personal experience, but then it's like this connection, right? Like women have always been running from or to something. And then the flourish of the door. I mean, it's wonderful to describe the door as the thick white lozenge. Perfect. You can see it perfectly. Yeah, that's what it looks like. But it's also the thick white lozenge, you think of a hospital, a cough drop, some kind of medicine. Again, you get all the sickness, right? And then the grammar seems to regulate here when she goes through the door. So no more run-ons, right? Like the one who is not too rich, I turned sideways and slipped through the needle's eye, and then I walked down the aisle toward my father. So much is just these 4 lines. Don't worry, I won't, but I could go on for a really long time just about, talk about compressing time, right? She's not walking in the hospital yet, but the crisis seems to be over. And she uses a biblical reference, right? It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. And I say this because it's going to seem very heaven-like when she gets through. She seems to leave that material world behind, as I said. And of course, this father isn't on the plane, but walking down the aisle, the speaker is more certain that her crisis can be averted. As this reader, for me, I couldn't help thinking of the church aisle, the father walking the daughter down the aisle, or you got the man with the flower on his breast, right? So I'm thinking maybe even a funeral, like walking down the aisle with a funeral procession, and she's with the casket. And in fact, the whole plane seems to be holy. In her description, the jet was full and people's hair was shining. They were smiling. The interior of the plane was filled with a mist of gold endorphin light. I wept as people weep when they enter heaven in massive relief. So the endorphin light, you think that I've been on a lot of planes. They never look like that, but it's projection, right? She is seeing like beauty and people and life. And even the endorphin light, I'm thinking stained glass windows or something, this chock full of image and emotion that, remember, took place in 7 minutes. So that's what I think is another completely brilliant move in this poem. But then even, I think, as a reader, something even more startling happens. We lifted up gently from one tip of the continent and did not stop until we sat down lightly on the other edge. We're in a run-on sentence again. I walked into his room and watched his chest rise slowly and sink again. All night, I watched him breathe. Okay, that's 3 sentences, but let's just call it 1 because Sharon made it 1. This last sentence does something so incredible in terms of like time and time bending. Okay, so Old condenses a cross-country flight, which I'm 6 hours, right? In which she probably slept, cried, wrote something down, read a book, watched a movie. That's even before the first comma. We lifted up gently from one tip of the continent and did not stop until we sat down lightly on the other. We have been like, with her every step of the way, every minutia, right? And now we're just like, okay, everything, we're just taking the flight. She skips deplaning. She skips getting a cab. She skips getting a visitor pass at the hospital. And said she just walks into his room. And there's something so brilliant here that every time I read this, it's, Beth Ann was saying the goosebumps. I get that like the top of my head, like, Sharon, how did you do that? Please tell us. It's just so brilliant. So the overnight visit, again, only is maybe a line and a half. All night I watched him breathe. That's it. So in addition to the crisis, this is also, I think, a poem, obviously, of witness and compassion and a tour de force, right, in terms of pacing, syntax, and the exact detail. So, and speaking of time, I read this 34 years ago for the first time, which is incredible. And every time I read it, I'm just like, bravo. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say. So thank you. Thanks for listening. Thanks. Thank you.
Bravo to you, Denise.
Thank you.
Seriously. I remember reading that poem for the first time. First of all, how's my volume, everyone?
Good.
Good. I remember reading that poem for the first time also. And it was in a introductory literature course. And it was in the anthology, X.J. Kennedy anthology. And my assignment was to find a poem over the weekend and to present. And I literally stumbled upon that poem and gasped, like you, by poem's end. And so much of what has stuck with me over the years in that poem is, and it revealed Sharon to be just a master at simile and metaphor. Those skewed orbits, the bags bumping. If you ever run with those bags, they totally have a control over you. That door, the thick white longage of that door just resonated in my mind. When people run in a airport, it is like they're slipping upstream in a river like salmon do. I just find I have lived with that poem not as long, but I definitely recall it. Probably 7 years later, I had encountered it. Um, the other thing about that poem is the pacing and the imagery matches the emotional desperation of someone who is about to lose a parent and needs to see them. We all know that that's one of the measures of our lives, that kind of that need for closure. And so by the time you get to that very simple, I walked into his room, there's so much relief and tension that's let out of the poem. I just find it still, like you,
It's like,
to be
yeah,
so
go ahead.
captivating and haunting in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Poems haunt us, which is the first line of this thing I'm about to read. Um, on Yusef Kumayaka's poem, Venus's Flytrap. And I'm happy I went after, because I think much of what I have to say here, which I've written out, because I thought, Denise, you were going to read what you've written. But some of what I have to say echoes Beth Ann's observations about Jericho Brown's poems. Again, I want to make sure that people can hear me, because I got noticed that that wasn't the case.
I think Tom put in the chat could be a little louder. So it sounds
Could
like
be a
you're,
little louder. Okay,
yeah,
I'll
it sounds
speak
like
a
you're
little louder.
75%. So, you
Yeah,
know.
it's that baritone voice. Venus's Flytrap. Some poems have a hold on us. Their lines haunt. One of my favorite activities in life is to spontaneously recite from memory a favorite poem, partially as a way of promoting the art, but ultimately because some poems contain a magic that cannot be experienced solely on the page. For obvious reasons, I don't do this on street corners or public transportation or in the dark of a movie theater. However, if we are friends or even remotely acquainted, you have heard me recite one of my beloved poems by Yusef Kumayaka, Venus's Flytraps, a poem I have read aloud at literary events and restaurants, between courses, and holiday parties. The title directly references the carnivorous plant that snaps shut on insects when they land on its red pallets. But Venus is also a reference to the Roman god of love and desire, charm, which becomes readily important as the poem continues. I recently found that it is now an endangered species list, a species that Darwin gave many of his pages to, Venus's flytrap. Spoken from the perspective of a precocious young boy who finds refuge in the outdoors, the poem gives voice to the adventurous spirit of children and their powers of intuition. I have a particular interest for poems that return us to that age where we emerge and grow into our intelligence, when so much of our social and emotional development as a child meant simply, at least in my time, an unstructured exploration of the world around me. These are risk taking poems that are either written from the perspective of an adult about some important moment in their childhood, or even better, often spoken in the voice of a child. Risk taking because it is difficult to traverse time as an adult and write in the voice that is convincing of our long ago selves. What strategies of speech and language must we return to invoke a child's voice, to achieve that believability? How can the adult mind sublimate and give room for that inner child that clearly still dwells within? Elizabeth Bishop does it in The Waiting Room. So does Gary Soto's Oranges. Wordsworth made a whole cottage industry of such poems. One thinks of Ode, intimations of immortality from recollections of childhood. Here's the poem: Venus's flytrap. I am 5, wading out into deep sunny grass, unmindful of snakes and yellow jackets, out to the yellow flowers quivering in sluggish heat. Don't mess with me, 'cause I have my Lone Ranger 6-shooter. I can hurt you with questions like silver bullets. The tall flowers in my dreams are big as the First State Bank, and they eat all the people except the ones I love. They have women's names with mouths like where babies come from. I am 5. I'll dance for you if you close your eyes, no peeping through your fingers. I don't suppose to be this close to the tracks. One afternoon, I saw what a train did to a cow. Sometimes I stand so close I can see the eyes of men hiding in boxcars. Sometimes they wave and holler for me to get back. I laugh when trains make the dogs howl, their ears hurt. I also know bees can't live without flowers. I wonder why Daddy calls Mama honey. All the bees in the world live in little white houses, except the ones in these flowers, all sticky and sweet inside. I wonder what death tastes like. Sometimes I toss the butterflies back into the air. I wish I knew why the music in my head makes me scared, but I know things I don't suppose to know. I could start walking and never stop. These yellow flowers go on forever. Almost to Detroit, almost to the sea. My mama says I'm a mistake, that I made her a bad girl. My playhouse is underneath our house, and I hear people telling each other secrets. The poem is composed of 20 graduated tercets, and thus a 60-line poem in which each line barely passes 6 to 7 syllables, and thus the short lines and hyperlineation, along with the graduated lines, create a forward momentum that gives the poem its spirited rhythm. The undercurrent theme is one of violence and danger wrought by both human and natural worlds, and this is amplified through the violence Youssef does on the poem's syntax. I say hyperlineated because the poem contains so many emphatic, enjambed line breaks in which adjectives are broken from modified nouns and phrases or verbs from predicates. The speaker in Venus's flytrap contains a rangy imagination and curiosity that afford him insight into the adult world, but also an ever widening instinct that perceives beyond the surface of things. Sexual desire. I wonder why Daddy calls Mama honey. The violent impact of humans on the natural world. One afternoon, I saw what a train did to a cow. One might argue that such deep seated insights are owed to the level of attention the natural world demands. So many ferns and grasses and bright colors and insects and hornets and animals teeming about that a child stimulated mind is in a way taught to absorb, and much of that absorption, too, as the poem reveals toward the end, means also soaking up the precarious and treacherous emotional states of adults. My mama says I'm a mistake, that I made her a bad girl. Sensuous details, natural imagery predominate and arrive with great velocity. In abundance here are bees, butterflies, yellow flowers, cows beside train tracks. And by the way, does anyone else think of of course, I think of the riding the rails that was so popular during post Depression, but one also thinks of the eyes of men hiding in boxcars. One thinks of also the Holocaust. That when I first encountered that poem, I gasped at the double image there. And yet, two images and illusions that insinuate so much more than on the surface. The First State Bank, the Lone Ranger 6-shooter alludes to that masked. I'm not sure if that's a still popular image today, but when we were younger, that was the masked ranger who fought outlaws, the fictional character that emerged as a 1933 radio show, and then through a popular TV series and movies over the year, problematically grew into one of the iconic and mythic characters that served as the basis of early childhood games, Cowboys and Indians, for example. The speaker here knows the danger in the world, and survival means satiating this need to know. I can hurt you with questions like silver bullets, he says. Beyond the poem's allusions, so many images in line here are memorable for their heartbreaking tenderness. I wish I knew why the music in my head makes me scared. Or sometimes I toss the butterflies back into the air, which we know children are capable of cruel violence. And that line, I wonder what death tastes like, makes me think of all those narratives about children torturing snakes and cats. But children's are also, like this speaker, capable of immense mercy. A captured butterfly is inspected, then tossed back into the air. What is apparent about children is the expansive, almost prescient nature of their intelligence, how they see beyond and intuit, and at times are unrelenting in their quest for answers. Any parent who has experienced that moment of a child's constant why at some point has felt the frayed edges and limitations of their patience and begun to bump against their own ignorance. If we are to accept the poem as autobiographical, a younger Youssef, then I also admire Youssef for capturing the inner life of a Black child. Since the death of Tamir Rice, I am deeply interested in collecting such poems, as I believe the more we invest Black children with that rich and wild space of imagining, the less we can fear what is simply a natural incarnation of a child's imagination. And what gets figured and celebrated as boisterous play in other children, for example, in Maurice Sendak's book, Where the Wild Things Are, becomes a space denied to Black children. Youssef's poem is a delicate commentary on a solitary child liberated by his imagination. As young adults, teachers know, children experience a range of all kinds of emotions: boredom, frustration, jealousy, and so much of their play is about reconciling these untamed emotions. Everything is blown up in their minds. Think about that first state bank. Think about Venus's flytrap, which reminds this speaker of, of a woman's body. Over the years, I have felt connected to this poem, to the speaker, having myself by necessity sought signs that will afford me a window into the minds of grown-ups and wish to understand the violence and danger around me. I'll stop there because I see that we are 3 minutes from, they said, I thought it was an hour, but 50 minutes.
That was fabulous. Thank you. Yeah, really, really good.
So
I thought
understand
of-
there might be questions.
Okay.
Do you see that there's a question from Sylvie? I'm going to read it, so y'all have to answer it first, and I'm buying myself time because it's a good question. She says, I struggle to add tension to my own writing. What other ways besides sentence structure might I play with to give my writing more feeling and tension? Thank you, Sylvie.
Line breaks are great. I mean, I think line breaks are, and I was, even in this, right? If you look at the Venus flytrap poem by Yusuf Komunyakaa, the 4th stanza, 6-shooter, I can hurt. You think like, there's so many things there, right? 6-shooter, I could be hurt by that. I can hurt you with it. I can hurt you with my questions. Suddenly, like it just totally changes the meaning, and the tension is like, okay, we can breathe again because it's only questions. It's not a real gun. And yeah, so I think line breaks, I would say, Sylvie, are a really fun way. If you have a poem that you're working on that just kind of is like, has a lot of dead weight, I would just work on what can I do here to make the tension go from one line to another. It's a start.
Mm-hmm. I know personally, I like to read poems in which a dramatic situation resolves itself by the end. and somehow a lot of times poems do that thing that we called scaffolding, like they kind of arrive at the dramatic situation, whereas if you kind of start off um, with some narrative that has this, well, what is going to happen,
Yeah.
and the poem is about that unfolding. It's a wonderful way to kind of arc a poem and to add what we call dramatic tension, which is a tool, of course, of fiction writers. But when it's compressed in a poem, I think it's felt even more.
And I can hop in quickly just to say, maybe one thing, Sylvia, to think about is when you release certain kinds of information. For example, in the Sharon Ohls poem, the flight's canceled, big deal. Then it says, my father would not live through the night and the flight was canceled. So that information raises the stakes of everything. In the sonnet I read, it's only at the very end that we get the crucial piece of information and it reflects back. So maybe play with where in your poem you could increase tension by revealing the right thing at the right time. And we might actually be out of time. So I don't know if someone's going to hop back in and say goodbye to everybody. But I just want to say how much I could have done this all day. If you guys want to keep on going, just talk to me about that. I'd love to hear all your genius thoughts and comments. And wasn't it nice to get that commentary from the people who are watching? Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you. It was really a blast. It was great to hear both of you. Really.